I had a rather interesting comment on my review of Candela Obscura, which covers several things that I like to bring up on the channel fairly often, and provides an opportunity to explain how and why I review things in the way that I do.
Pack it up, pack it in, let me begin. I came to win, battle me, that's a sin.
This video is confusing. After taking a look at the game, I can say that it's actually mediocre, and that it serves the needs of a particular group who play scripted games in public more than those of private customers who just want to play. But all I can understand from your video is that you don't like Apocalypse World, which is another game, not this one. Also, you mostly don't like it for reasons which I find baffling, but it doesn't really matter. I'm not commenting to defend Apocalypse World's system, and I will not even say my opinion about it. The point is that this doesn't feel like a review at all, and your personal opinion about Apocalypse World, Lovecraft, Barker, and what's horror don't help understand a thing about the game. What I could understand from the video is so vague that it could be interpreted in at least two ways, which is one way too much. No discrimination in a horror game? Okay, so what? Is the theme of the game the meaning of horror in a society with no discrimination? That would be super interesting. But your video doesn't let me understand if that's the case. It just tells me that you liked The Matrix more, which is irrelevant at best. Also, the "there are dragons" thing doesn't actually work the way you say. "There are dragons" is something you say to justify plot holes or inconsistencies, not to justify a premise. In this setting, "there are dragons" is as true as having a favoured pronoun is okay. Any judgment on the matter is a purely aesthetic one. You can accept it, like it, or belittle it with faux psychology. I have an opinion on the matter as well, but again, totally irrelevant for the purpose of this comment. You say it is easier to accept a dragon than a society that has different problems from ours, but that is really just your problem, not a universal truth. Really, came in to know more about a game, came out knowing more about you. It is poetic and beautiful, but also disappointing. Roberto. So what seems to have confused Roberto is the method by which I review things. Books, games, films, whatever. And so it's probably worthwhile doing a little explainer of how and why I review things in the way that I do, and why some people may find that confusing. And no disrespect is meant here. I'm just explaining myself and providing opinion on how I arrive at my opinions. I feel that it is disrespectful to dumb down and to over-explain things, but I do also feel that while I credit my audience with some intelligence, that it is important to contextualize and to explain my viewpoint and why and how I have arrived at it. Maybe some of that is a touch of imposter syndrome, perhaps, so a desire to explain myself and establish my bona fides. But I also think it adds value to the videos, even to people who disagree with me, because I am explaining why I feel a certain way about a product, rather than simply telling you that I hate or love something without explaining why. I usually try to find something positive to say, as well as however much negative I might have to say, and vice versa. Crisscross. So, in this instance, why bring up Apocalypse World? Well, Candela Obscura is derived from Blades in the Dark, which itself is derived from Apocalypse World, and it shares key design philosophies with these other story games, which are not really role-playing games. Now, Blades in the Dark, and to a greater extent Dungeon World, move away from the narrativist meta-level game style of Apocalypse World and towards the more prosaic and usual way of playing role-playing games. But Candela Obscura moves back towards that meta level play. What do I mean by that? I mean you are not inhabiting and playing as your character, but you are playing more of an authorial role in the game. You are not thinking and acting and reacting as your character. You are thinking and acting and reacting as an author, providing situations and making decisions on that basis rather than the character in the moment. It is anti-immersive. You can try to play these games that way, but they are not optimized for playing that sort of way. And this is counter to immersion, which I regard as being probably the primary goal in playing a role-playing game, is to find yourself thinking and acting in the moment, in the narrative structure as the character, rather than directing the character. It's a difficult transition. It's a difficult difference to really pick out, but it is a very real and a very important one, in my opinion. So why bring up horror? Why bring up Lovecraft and his prejudice, or Barker and his repression? And what even is horror? Well, I bring it up because I think that Candela Obscura misses the mark, particularly with its preachiness, and that requires me to explain why I believe it has missed the mark, and why the giants of the genre are often, if not always, the way that they are. Now, if the author of Candela Obscura had created a game based around the things that they clearly regard as horrifying, such as slavery, racial prejudice, gender prejudice, and so on, if they'd put their hang-ups and their concerns into the game, doubtless it would have been far more effective as a game than the hectoring, scolding tone that the game actually takes, because these are things that they clearly care about and think are bad and wrong and evil, and that is why they belong in these sorts of games, why they're so effective in these sorts of games, and why someone's personal prejudices, hang-ups, things that disturb them often come out of the page more, or the cellulose or the digital file more than otherwise. But this game goes out of its way to remove all the petty horrors and disgusts and nastinesses that we recognize and that we see, and to eliminate them from a world that is meant to be dark and horrific. It's directly opposed to the purpose of creating a horror game, and castrates its chance at effectiveness. The "but my dragons" excuse works exactly the way I describe. It's the uncanny valley for societies and human interaction, for cultures and civilizations. We're social animals, finely attuned to the thoughts and feelings of those around us, unless of course you're a sociopath. Even then, you're usually aware of them and just exploit them. We're woven into human societies. It is our everyday, and it's important to us. And so when a human, or a human enough, I suppose, society doesn't work in a way that feels authentic and internally consistent, we notice. In the same way we notice when CGI isn't quite right, and that's more disturbing than when it's cartoonish. And yes, this "but my dragons" is used to justify premises and to excuse things that make no sense, usually post hoc, and when trying to stand in judgment over someone that doesn't feel these sorts of creative choices are valid, plausible, or effective. Just yesterday on TikTok, I had someone strawmanning this argument, saying, well, you can accept dragons and magic, but you can't accept a multicultural society in an ahistorical fantasy setting. which of course is a straw man of the issue. The fantastical elements, I would say, in fact, necessitate that the rest makes sense, that the rest is plausible, that it hangs together. In our real past, plenty of people believed in devils, dragons, chimera, monsters, and magic, and it almost doesn't matter whether these things were ever real or not, because these same people also believed that the people from the next village over, let alone another nation, were weird, alien, possibly corrupted by devils or in league with pagan powers, just because they talk a bit funny. Butma Dragons is a facile and stupid justification for changes in a world that make no sense and attack that plausibility and again that sense of immersion. Even the most alien settings in fiction, when effective, remain internally consistent and plausible, from Consider Phlebas to Perdido Street Station. The prejudices and issues might be different in a fantasy society, but humans are humans, and near humans are nearly human. And these prejudices are going to exist in these worlds, at least without elements that do a lot more heavy lifting than Butma Dragons. Like, what does the existence of dragons have to do with the existence of racism, other than maybe prejudice towards dragons? Very little, if anything. So it's a complete non sequitur. The Federation from Star Trek, at least in its earlier incarnation, had explanations that made sense. A post-scarcity society recovered from very near self-extinction, but it still had its prejudices about alien races, about Klingons, about Romulans, etc. Later on about the Ferengi, who were set up to be antithetical to many Federation values. And Star Trek set up humanism and compassion, the idea that humanity had progressed beyond, that it was community builders, same thing in Babylon 5 to an extent. And they set that up in contrast to these unreformed societies, which were set up as exaggerations of human qualities that we also recognized. A review is part objectivity and part subjectivity. The build quality of the game, the page count, the artistic quality, the degree of value for money, and so on. That's more objective. And they're also part subjective. Taste, personal viewpoint, personal experience, and expertise. That all comes in. So it's important then to establish not only what my viewpoint on a product is, but how and why I have arrived at it. My personal history with games or whatever, the justifications, where any authority that I have might derive from, and so on. So to return to the specifics, why bring up Apocalypse World? Because Apocalypse World is a type of game that I do not think is a role-playing game. It is something else, because the play takes place at that meta level, and that is also true of Candela Obscura. You do not inhabit and experience the character. It is anti-immersive. Maybe that's another aspect we need to take into account when we're talking about games and their mechanics and their aims and so on. Why bring up Lovecraft, Barker, and so on? Well, Lovecraft's prejudices came out in his work. I think he is unfairly judged, especially given how he changed his attitudes later in his life. But that appears on the page. His hang-ups and his prejudices, the things that horrified and unsettled him, and so his horror and unsettledness comes off the page, and it makes it more effective. Barker was repressed for much of his life, both about his homosexuality and his BDSM fetishism apparently. That's something I can empathise with. And so that comes out in his work, in the Books of Blood, his disquiet and unease about female anatomy, pregnancy, the weird power that women seem to hold as opposed to male power in society. That all comes out, and it gives his work an edginess and an almost palpable subtext that increases the effectiveness of the horror, whether it's byblows or swimming pools with creatures in them that can change your sex, whatever it is. And that is a part of what makes that horror effective. And so my opinion on what makes horror effective is important and relevant, and helps you understand Candela Obscura in the way that it fails. Right? I believe that it fails at being a horror game, and this is part of the reason why. That there is no discrimination or recognizable human traits to the society in Candela Obscura kills my suspension of disbelief, and plays into this but my dragons thing, this uncanny valley of human interaction and society. So it makes the world not make sense even before you get to the horrific or supernatural elements. And the existence of horrific and supernatural elements makes no odds to how believable or not, or how plausible, how internally consistent such a society is. Would a society paranoid about the effects of strange creatures from beyond that were constantly being validated as real and true, would that be such a harmonious, free society, or would it be riddled with paranoia, suspicion, and prejudice, and people using the excuse of the supernatural? Hell, we can look at the real world for this. There are nations in Africa where people still get killed for being witches, and failures of crops or erectile dysfunction or whatever else will be blamed on the local witch, and hatred will be heaped upon them whether they're innocent or not. So even in the 21st century this happens, and it makes no odds to people's prejudices. In fact, it plays into them. There is no explanation, there is no plausible means by which the society in Candela Obscura is so different. It is trying to evoke that Victorian, or I guess Call of Cthulhu 1920s. It's trying to evoke that kind of society, early 20th century sort of effort, and yet has very little that's recognizable to the society and the mindset. Very few of the signifiers that we would recognize as pointing to that period, other than the most surface veneer. And apologists will say, oh, but there's supernatural stuff, you can believe that, but you can't believe X unbelievable thing about this society that makes no sense given what we know about human psychology and sociology. Yeah, damn right. It makes no difference. The existence of dragons has zero relevance to it. The existence of something at the cutting edge of science today, such as, I don't know, WIMP detectors, or new states of matter that are being discovered at extremes, superfluids, plasmas, whatever, that makes no odds to the way our society is constructed and how we interact as human beings. So, but yeah, I think you do come out of my review knowing more about the game and its failings, but you also come away knowing a bit more about how and why I come to the opinions that I do, and that it's not whatever people want to write me off as. Pointing at someone and shrieking racist, sexist, whatever else is harder to do when I have explained the real reasons that I don't like something, don't get on with something, right? I mean, screaming racist at someone who disagrees with you is the butt my dragons of comment sections, really, especially when someone's given an explanation, which is why I do. Zang. There are certain kinds of people, ale-drinking people, people who did a little too much acid in the 60s, people who wear large warm jumpers and take long brisk walks in the countryside. These people maintain that fairies not only exist, but that they are very common. They also tend to believe that fairies are a countryside phenomenon, much like casual cruelty to animals, sexual intercourse with sheep, and having an impenetrable and parochial accent. This is, of course, rather wide of the mark. Fairies have always had a strong relationship with man, darning his socks, cobbling his shoes, cleaning his houses, drowning him, marrying him, and swapping his children for malformed hydrocephalics as a bit of a jape, and otherwise aiding or demeaning the efforts of man. Fairies do not need our belief to exist, they need us and the things that we leave around. Like an urban fox or the aerial rat known as the pigeon, if they survive, they will have adapted to city life and found their niches, not in tending to flowers and trees, but in crashing computers, letting down the tyres on people's cars, and eating leftover pizza. Urban Fairy is a game of those kind of fairies, gone feral and urban, adapted to modern life. It's a comedy game of hijinks, weirdness, and strangeness, and it almost runs itself. You want Urban Fairy Pocket Edition, which is revised and updated with better art and edited writing, and it's available from post-mort.com, DriveThruRPG, and lulu.com.
Ba-ba-da-da-da-da.